Greetings and welcome. Today we're considering a very important contribution to the course, and that's the question of how moral philosophy, broadly considered, can contribute to the topic of how to confront, how to understand, and how to learn from the examples of evil which we've been considering throughout the course. We've seen such voluminous evidence of horrific behavior by apparently normal, ordinary human beings in the past 3 months of study and reading, and I might say excellent presentations. Ordinary order police willingly murdered thousands of Jews in Eastern Europe. We are also made aware of the casual indifference of wide publics in Germany, France, Britain, and the United States to the atrocities being performed during World War II against vast groups of human beings in Eastern Europe. We are perhaps aware also of our own knowledge and our weak protest against Chinese crimes against Uyghurs, deaths at sea of thousands of desperate refugees in the Mediterranean, the Atlantic. And we also understand that US citizens, we ourselves, did not react urgently and effectively against the use of so-called extreme methods of interrogation, or honestly called torture, during the Bush administration, or the abuse of prisoners at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. So how can we understand these behaviors by human beings very much like ourselves? Several questions remain for us to address. First, how to explain these behaviors by our neighbors, our fellow human beings. Second, what social, ideological, organizational, and normative circumstances lead human beings to commit these kinds of actions and inactions, these kinds of atrocities? What are the bulwarks against cruelty and indifference in ordinary human moral sentiments? And today we're going to spend a good deal of time talking about the idea of compassion and imaginative understanding of the suffering of others. There's one answer to the question, what are the bulwarks against evil, which has been offered by philosophers and also by religions of the world, that the bulwarks are moral codes, moral laws and commandments. For example, the idea that there are moral rules that govern human behavior, and avoiding cruelty and murder is a fundamental moral rule. But perhaps here is a more basic answer, a more fundamental answer. Human beings offer generosity and kindness, and human beings refrain from cruelty and violence when they recognize the reality of the sufferings of others. So there's a direct connection, I'm suggesting, and Martha Nussbaum is suggesting, between a capacity for compassion and imagination and an openness, a willingness, a readiness to commit violence and cruelty against human beings. So what are compassion and imagination? These are faculties of the mind, or facilities of the mind that human beings possess that lead them to kindness towards others and away from wanton cruelty. But imagination by itself is not enough. We need to understand, and this is one of the things which Martha Nussbaum spends a good deal of ink in trying to explicate, we need to understand that compassion is a moral emotion. And what she means by this is something like this: I imagine the suffering of the other, and I want the other not to suffer. I feel an impulse, a desire that the other should not suffer. I want to avoid causing his or her suffering. I want to help end her suffering. That's the action part of compassion. That's the motivational part. So it is interesting, and I think also important to notice, that compassion is not just a feeling. It is a cognitive feeling. It involves imaginative knowledge of the reality of the other person. When the cartoon figure Wile E. Coyote smashes into the wall and we imagine his pain, we don't feel compassion for Wile E. Coyote because we know that cartoon figures do not suffer real pain. But if a human child runs his tricycle into a solid wall, we cringe, we feel pain for the child's pain. So we can ask a preliminary question. What would make a society more resilient to the commission of evil by its state, by its institutions, and by its people? So I'd like to ask you to imagine some basic questions. What if most children and young adults became much more aware of the reality and potential for suffering of others? What if most children and young adults came to recognize the vileness of prejudice, racism, and hatred of other groups? What if most children and young adults acquired social habits of behavior involving respect for others, kindness, and willingness to help others in distress? In other words, what if there were a process through which young people, children and young adults, became more capable of compassion? Then we can ask the question, would the Holocaust, would mass cruelty, and would enslavement become impossible in such a society? And regrettably, I think the answer is no. Compassion by itself does not preclude the possibility of genocide, enslavement, torture, and Holocaust, but it does influence that possibility. We can make Holocaust, we can make genocide less likely by becoming more compassionate as a population of people. And we might indeed speculate that racism, homophobia, white supremacy, anti-Semitism, misogyny, nationalist hatred, and religious bigotry would decline in the society I just described to almost zero. That is indeed a good outcome. But we have also seen by reading Snyder and reading other works of history and sociology in the course, we've seen that organizations, states, institutions, ideologies can lead people, can pressure people, can inspire, and can coerce people to do the bidding of cruel and evil leaders. Stalinism is an example. Hitler's Nazi state is an example. Pol Pot in Cambodia is an example. So a more fundamental answer to the question, how can we make Holocaust vastly less likely? We can focus on making institutions resilient against evil, but this is both harder and more fundamental, because compliant organizations, corporations, we saw them, military organizations, civic organizations, compliant organizations, and evil leaders can bring about massive evil on the part of citizens, even citizens who have lots of capacity otherwise for compassion. Therefore, we need to work to secure political institutions that involve strong fire breaks, strong guardrails against evil. Totalitarian political systems have no fire breaks. The leader can drive the institution and the people towards evil ends. And I would put it forward to you that liberal constitutional democracies do in fact have fire breaks. Leaders are constrained in their actions. Groups of concerned citizens are free to dissent and protest. Legislators are able to pressure their own executive governments to change course. So liberal constitutional democracies have built-in ability to reduce the likelihood of genocidal and atrocious actions by dictators. Furthermore, international organizations like the United Nations or NATO or other international organizations can create additional normative and institutional fire breaks or guardrails against evil actions by states. Again, this is not a certainty, it's not a guarantee, but it's an effort that we can make in the way that we might make efforts to prevent the damage of catastrophic flooding or catastrophic fire, to take specific steps to make our society less vulnerable to these risks. And in the end, what we would be aspiring to is a resilient society in a world of potential evil. And what might that amount to? Well, here's a thought. it might be a society, a population, a mass-based and modern society consisting of resilient, compassionate citizens who are well-informed and committed to ensuring the just and moral actions of their government, so active democratic citizens. Second, political institutions embodying the political and civil rights of citizens. Third, political institutions limiting the powers and actions of presidents, governors, prime ministers, limiting them by constitution, by law, and by norm. And fourth, a society in which racism and bigotry at home has been vanquished, where there is no political violence against individuals or groups, a society in which there are strong constraints against war crimes by states and by paramilitary groups in international conflicts. And in evidence of the idea that these steps can in fact make genocide, make atrocities less likely, it's worth remembering what Timothy Snyder described in the case of Denmark under Nazi occupation. The institutions of the Danish state, the monarchy, the court system, the bureaucracy, the police, did in fact succeed in resisting Nazi efforts to deport and eventually exterminate Danish Jews. A system of law, a system of bureaucratic administration was indeed capable of fending off atrocious action. So let's turn now to Nussbaum and what Nussbaum has to say about compassion and about radical evil. She begins with the drama of the Greek hero Philoctetes. And I'd like to begin with the quote that she attributes to the chorus of soldiers who are chanting about this soldier, this leader, Philoctetes. "For my part, I pity him, thinking of how, with no living soul to care for him, seeing no friendly face, wretched, always alone, he suffers with a fierce affliction and has no resources to meet his daily needs. How in the world does the poor man survive?" This is an expression of compassion and pity. The members of the chorus imagine this man, whom they do not know directly and personally. In that act, they stand in for the imaginative activity of the audience, for whom the entire tragic drama is also an exercise of sympathy and compassion. Quoting from Nussbaum, "Why should this be important for people who are thinking about the relationship between the individual and the community? I can give three reasons. First, compassion in the philosophical tradition is a central bridge between the individual and the community. It is conceived of as our species' way of hooking the interests of others to our own personal goods." But she also argues that we need to clarify the meaning of pity and compassion along the lines of what I discussed a few minutes ago, that pity and compassion are not merely feelings, they are not merely emotions, rather they are emotions which incorporate reason and knowledge into their composition. She talks about three factors which go into the idea of being compassionate for an individual who is suffering: the size of the loss, whether the individual had some fault in creating the loss, and the similarity to one's own case. Can I imagine being in a similar situation myself? Quoting from Nussbaum, "This fact explains why so frequently those who wish to withhold pity and to teach others to do so portray the sufferers as altogether dissimilar in kind and in possibility. In The Destruction of the European Jews, Raoul Hilberg shows how pervasively the Nazi talk of Jews in connection with their murder portrayed them as non-human, either as being of a remote animal kind, such as insects or vermin, or as inanimate objects, cargo to be transported." And here her point is a very clear one. It is to withdraw the idea that the citizen, the observer, should be compassionate to the Jew who's being tormented and disrespected and humbled and killed. Remove that person from the possibility of pity and compassion by treating them as being less than human. She refers to the moral education of Emile, the subject of Rousseau's novel, Emile. And here's what she has to say about it. But Rousseau claims he does not really believe or judge that this is so, this situation of pitiable circumstance, until he has become able to imagine their suffering vividly to himself and to suffer the pain of pity. To see it without feeling is not to know it. Those are Rousseau's words. By this, he means something very precise, that the suffering of others has not become a part of Emile's cognitive repertory in such a way that it will influence his conduct or provide him with motives and expectations and so forth. He's merely paying it lip service until he can imagine it in a way that is sufficient for being disturbed. It's a kind of a complicated passage, but it's worth thinking about, because what Nussbaum is saying is really, she's referring to the fact that we say very glibly, oh, we pity the refugees who are fleeing Iraq or Afghanistan. We pity the children who are drowning in the Mediterranean. But the point here is that if it's merely words, if it's merely marks on a chalkboard, then it's not real pity, it's not real compassion, that it's necessary to link the emotion of the pitiable feeling with the knowledge of what the circumstances of the other are. Is compassion motivational? Are we led to act in certain ways if we experience compassion? It seems kind of evident that when a human being is full of compassion for another human being, as Nussbaum describes it, then this person is also in a situation of having a motive to attempt to help. Feeling strong compassion leads one to want to help, to contribute to relieving the suffering or to preventing it from happening in the first place. And this is the point of truly knowing and imagining the suffering of the other. Now back to the question of teaching compassion, that thought experiment I had about children and young adults. Quoting Nussbaum, if we believe that the ability to imagine the ills of another with vivid sympathy is an important part of being a good person, then we will want to follow Rousseau in giving support to procedures by which this ability is taught. Much of this will and should be done privately in families, but every society employs and teaches ideals of the citizen and of good civic judgment in many ways, and there are some concrete practical strategies that will in fact support an education in compassion. So she believes, and she also expresses that Rousseau appears to believe, that we can, through civic education, through poetic education, as we're about to see, we can teach the capacity for compassion, and that is a very, very good thing. Now let's talk about radical evil. What is radical evil? The concept itself seems to be very closely related to the topic of evil in the Holocaust, evil in the Holodomor, evil in genocide. But let's read a couple of passages from this second article that I asked you to read. How then can a respectful, pluralistic society shore up the fragile human basis of toleration, especially in a world in which we need to cultivate toleration not only within each state, but also among peoples and states in this interlocking world? How do we get a citizenry who have toleration for each other's differences? That's the question number one. All such democracies, therefore, have strong reasons to support an idea of toleration understood as involving respect, not only grudging acceptance, and to extend it to all religious and secular doctrines, limiting only conduct that violates the rights of other citizens. This norm is widely shared. So she's beginning with the idea of toleration, which is really mutual respect and mutual acceptance, even if there are things about which we disagree. But toleration or tolerance is the state of community in which individuals respect the rights and the right to be of the other individuals in society. So she began by talking about Locke, but she turns to Kant and eventually to Rousseau in order to explicate which he thinks is a very fertile conception of radical evil. So let's hear what she has to say about that. Evil is radical, according to Kant. That is to say, it goes to the root. Radical has to do with roots. It goes to the root of our humanity, because human beings, prior to any experience, have a propensity to both good and evil in the form of tendencies that are deeply rooted in our natures. We are such that we can follow the moral law, but there is also something about us that makes it virtually inevitable that under certain circumstances, we will disregard it and behave badly. So this is Kant's view of the inseparability of the possibility of evil from humanity, which is what we, in a different light, saw in Ordinary Men and the fact that terrible things were done during the evils of the 20th century. Resuming quotation, whenever human beings are together, then, according to Kant, bad behavior is a likely outcome, and intolerance is one prominent form that such bad behavior typically takes. Intolerance, remember, hatred of the Jews and willingness to murder the Jews, that's the extreme case of intolerance. Intolerance typically takes as one very prominent form of competitive self-love. Intolerance, then, is not an easily eradicated social condition. People will, in general, seek to violate the rights of others, and in particular, will seek to establish the superiority of their own religious doctrines. Although Kant himself does not make this connection between his doctrine of evil and the specific problem of intolerance, it is strongly suggested by his argument. Continuing her quote, Kant was surely right in thinking that one very important part of the solution is the vigilant protection of freedoms of speech, press, and scholarship. Intolerance thrives in a situation in which opinion is curtailed, and we may observe that intolerant groups usually, if not always, seek the curtailment of these freedoms as a road to domination. One more thing that a society may certainly do, and that most societies do already, is to attach rituals and ceremonies to the basic freedoms protected by the society, inspiring citizens to love those values by linking the values to music, art, and ritual. So again, she's grappling with the question, how do we move from philosophy to powerfully felt civic emotions and human emotions which contribute to a just society and a society which will not commit evil against others? Now let's turn to Rousseau and her use of Rousseau. Quote, in the important section of the social contract on civil religion, Rousseau argues that complete toleration in spiritual matters is of great importance, but that it needs to be undergirded by the promulgation of a civil religion consisting of sentiments of sociality, without which it is impossible to be a good citizen or a faithful subject. Those were Rousseau's words. In other words, Rousseau is asserting that a just society requires emotions which go beyond self-interest. It requires emotions of sociality, mutual acceptance, respect of others, respect for the freedoms of others. This religion, this civil religion, a kind of moralized deism fortified with patriotic beliefs and sentiments, will hold the state together and create moral unanimity among citizens. The goal of this, the reason why she's quoting this, is that she recognizes what I think in the end, anyone who studies liberal political philosophy will recognize, that a conception of the state, the legitimacy of the state, the importance of individual rights, along the lines of Locke, Hume, Hobbes, anyone who bases it entirely on rational self-interest, that society will not be a strong haven for democracy. We need something somewhat stronger. We need a strong moral commitment to the equality of all citizens and the moral worth of all citizens, which is to say, we need to create a powerful, shared civic or civil moral emotion. She then turns to Walt Whitman, who happens to be one of my favorite poets, and the role of democratic poetry. Quoting from her, Whitman understood and repeatedly asserted that the civic fabric of a democracy cannot be held together by laws and institutions alone. Quote, to hold men together by paper and seal or by compulsion is no account. Continuing Whitman, what is needed is something which aggregates all in a living principle. And that, Whitman insists, can be supplied only by poets. Writing during the Civil War, very significant, he says that the US needs poets more than any other country does. Quote from Whitman, their presidents shall not be their common referee so much as their poets shall. And why poetry? Well, because poetry has the capacity to elicit strong moral emotions which are motivational. When we are inspired by Whitman and the equality of men and women, we are also led to act on the basis of that. This is a longish quote about radical evil, which I won't read to you, but you have read it and you can read it again in the slides. But the basic idea is that radical evil is not piecemeal. We need to understand that it is a function, it is a piece of human life, and we need to design institutions and community relationships and community institutions in such a way as to ameliorate the possibility, the tendency towards evil expressions.